but those strivings that he was yearning for, I think that's a universal experience that people have. Like pretty much everybody goes through some sort of conversion in their life. Hopefully they do. And as you do, there's inevitably going to be some form of rebellion, whether it's outward or inward. And as you're going through that, you might not have a proper understanding. You might have not been properly catechized, or maybe you did and you just like to sin, like most of us. And so you have that experience, and then it's only afterwards that you have that ability to reflect back and say, okay, well, golly, like I was striving for something. I was aiming for some sort of temporal good, some sort of momentary fleeting happiness. But I think it's once Augustine has matured in his own spirituality, and he has that intellectual conversion, he's then able to put pen to paper in a way that tells us a little bit more of what was actually taking place as he was yearning for those things and not finding that rest that his soul longed for.
Throughout life, we meet others who have insights and experiences quite unlike our own. The great ideas of classical works resonate differently with them. Often these treasures of mind and heart go unshared, reserved from others in the course of daily life. But what if we took the time to have those conversations, to sit down and recall those thoughts, those impressions upon us that moved us along our path? Why then, we would no longer be alone, and at least for one shimmering moment, someone else could see the world through our eyes. I give you the Confederal Reserve. Welcome to the Confederal Reserve presented by BetterPears. I am your host, Dr. Jason Fugikawa. The Confederal Reserve is a show that connects old friends, that is, Confederates, to discuss the ideas and classical works that have shaped their lives and worldviews. Before we get going, I invite you to like this episode, subscribe to the BetterPears channel if you have not already, and click the bell icon to receive notifications so that you remain the first to know of future interviews and podcast episodes. If you would like to support the work of BetterPears with your Federal Reserve notes and receive fractional gold in the mail each month, please follow the link in the description to our crowdfunding program, BetterPears Leaves. As a special bonus for the rest of 2024, every qualifying contribution earns an entry into our monthly Market Mug giveaway. Official rules are available at betterpears.com/giveaway. Now then, the structure of the show is our gimmick we want you to mimic. Our guest for the episode will offer a classical work of particular import to his or her life. What ensues is a conversation that uncovers insights and offers new perspectives on old works. It is a conversation between friends, which is the building block of the cultural renaissance that BetterPears seeks to foster. Our guest today is Michael Towle. Michael graduated with a master's degree in theology from Ave Maria University and is married to friend of the show, Dr. Kristen Towle. They have 8 children, including toddler twins. He has been in the software sales for over 13 years and currently lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It's my great pleasure to welcome our guest today on the Confederal Reserve, Michael Towle. Welcome, Michael.
Thanks, Jason, and happy Feast of St. Augustine.
Yes. We'll release this hopefully over the weekend, but today is the Feast of St. Augustine, so happy Feast of St. Augustine to you as well, patron of BetterPears. Our first question, the one we kind of kick things off with, is what is your vintage work and why is it so important?
So as we discussed probably about a month and a half ago now, as you and I were trying to figure out a work that would be most desirable, I chose the Confessions of St. Augustine, and we decided to focus the conversation today on Book 2.
Yes, Book 2. In my mind, Book 2 is kind of the pear scene, the stealing of the pears, kind of the idea behind the idea of BetterPears, right? That he had BetterPears at home. There are a few other aspects to the chapter as well, to the book chapter as well in Augustine's Confessions, but there are sort of themes that emerge. So where do you want to go first in this conversation?
Yeah, great. So actually, before I even dive into the book, first, most of what follows will probably be reviewed to many of your listeners, so I apologize in advance for anything that seems trivial. Candidly, I'm just a novice when it comes to studying St. Augustine. But before we begin, I thought that it'd be worth at least highlighting for folks, although they'll probably end up watching this, like you said, on the weekend. Yesterday was Monica's feast day, the Feast of St. Monica. She, of course, was the patron of conversions and mother to St. Augustine. And, it's worth noting that, she spent 17 years of her life praying for her son and is now deemed a great saint. When I think of Saint Augustine, and part of the reason why when you and I were speaking about what work would make sense, I thought about Augustine's life. Right, he starts his adolescent life embracing immorality. He gave a lot of his time and energy towards lust and impurity, but he eventually converted to Catholicism, and he's now recognized as a great saint and doctor of the church. So there's hope for every sinner, which is great news. I identified a lot with, so I was a cradle Catholic, but left the Catholic Church for about 7 years and reverted to the church during my college years. And so although I didn't have a conversion to Catholicism the exact same way that Augustine did, my reversion to Catholicism made me always kind of just my ears perked up when I would hear about St. Augustine after I'd read the Confessions for the first time in college. And so, when I'm thinking about my own life and what I hope to leave as a legacy for my family, I mentioned Monica because, she died a happy death knowing that the son who she'd prayed to convert to the faith did, and she's a lasting witness to the effectiveness of persistence, prayerful determination, fasting, and sacrifices on behalf of those who need conversion. And so, as we look at Saint Augustine, we look at his life and the conversion that he discusses in the book, and we see that he is this, as we know him, a towering intellect, a prolific author, bishop, and a doctor of the church. But at that phase in his life, at that stage, he was really struggling with sin and didn't have God in his life the way that he eventually came to embrace him. And so, when I think about the Confessions of Augustine, I can't think of a better book as a Christian to read and to ponder how we can reflect on our own sinfulness and turn to God in a way that's going to be meaningful. So I was actually this morning, Bishop Barron released free access to his pivotal players on St. Augustine, which I think he does each year, just as a gratis to people who subscribe to things. And so he had mentioned that Augustine of Hippo is described as one of the three or four most important players in the history of the church and a pivotal figure in the development of Western civilization. And I thought that was a great way to sum up. If you don't know anything about Augustine, those are some pretty heavy-hitting accolades. So that's
Sure.
kind of the long and short of why I chose it. What I'd love to do is spend just a little bit of time talking about Augustine in general, a little bit of time on the Confessions in general, and then dive into book two. But want to give you some
Sure.
time to.
Yeah, no, I mean, one of the things about kind of engaging the Confessions is you kind of pick up in his sort of his preface or his introduction in book one is that you're kind of dealing with two Augustines in the autobiography, right? Because there's the Augustine living through the autobiographical portions of the Confessions, the first sort of 10 books, and then kind of the narrator or the kind of the perspective in which the autobiography is kind of cast for us is of this more mature Augustine, right? This one was sort of Bishop Augustine. And so one of the ways that I think the Confessions is a classic in the sense that it admits of more than one reading, right? I just had a guest on recently. We talked about Northanger Abbey and like vampirism, but I do think there's a vampirism in the way that many people approach classical works. By that I mean they want to read it one time and just suck all the blood out of it, and like this is my definitive reading of Augustine's Confessions. And I don't think it's a work that allows that, because if you read it as a young person, perhaps somebody in the midst of his own life, right, and young people are fraught with various temptations and hormones are going crazy anyway, right? It's different kind of looking back at the Confessions now as I am in my technically Dante middle age, to kind of see kind of the insights that the narrator Augustine, looking back at his youthful sin, at what was tempting him, what were the lesser goods that he sought, like that's kind of an additional payoff that we get that a classic allows, because it is talking about human nature, talking about the human experience with sin, which is contrary to nature, right?
Yeah.
And then the redemptive aspect of this relationship with Christ that develops throughout the course of the Confessions, develops out throughout the course of the Christian journey. So
Yes.
so that's kind of one thing I think our viewers might want to know, and hopefully spark some interest as they perhaps venture into the Confessions for the first time, or for the first time in a long time. But
Yeah, no, I think you hit on a good point. I mean, when I read Augustine for the first time, it was in college. It was in a reading and writing in the Western traditions class with a professor, Dr. Mark Reasoner, who has since converted to Catholicism and now teaches at Marian University in Indiana. And the first time that I read the book, the work, book two actually did stand out as a pivotal experience in Augustine's life of basically, indulgence, essentially, giving into passion. But I also think that, like you had mentioned, right, there's this maturation that takes place in his own journey that I think is very rich and poignant for anybody in their, journey towards God, in our efforts towards sanctification and growing in holiness. And, I always thought that there's a practicality or a practicalness to Augustine's, I'll call it theopraxis, where even though he wasn't necessarily embracing Christianity in the early stages of the book, you see this sense of practical wisdom coming through the way in which he's just reflecting on how the things that he was doing were either, wanton, or they were still, striving for this sense of, he at one point he says in book one, he says that, our hearts are restless unless they rest in you, O God. And then later on, he goes on to say that, he always was desiring to love and to be loved. And so I think that there's this notion of, he's plumbing the depths of human sin and his own personal need for redemption. And he's kind of almost, I think, almost creating a new literary genre of autobiography in the way that he tells the story. May not be necessarily the absolute first, but the way that he does it, I think, is pretty unique. And although, there's many more works throughout human history that can also have this heavy hitting effect, I think, he in book three actually goes out and says, it's in your presence, my God, that I tell this story to my own race, and that anyone who reads this may think from how great a depth we must call upon you, and what comes closer to your ears than a heart that confesses a life that is lived by faith. And so I think, early on within the work, he's recognizing that his internal struggle is something that's not only something that he can reflect on to grow in holiness, but he can also then pass that on to posterity to be able to grow in their spiritual life as well.
I think on that point, I this aspect of autobiography in Augustine's case, and kind of the precedent of biography in his own conversion, right? That the life of Saint Anthony of the Desert, Saint Anthony of Egypt, by Saint Athanasius, plays this sort of pivotal role in his conversion, right? Of this example of somebody who kind of renounced the world, right, to go live in the desert, to stumble in, late to the gospel, reading and mass or divine liturgy or whatever, and giving all his things to the poor and following Christ, who just kind of exudes that, who takes up that as his mantle and his way. And yet Anthony is wise, right? Has this knowledge of the scripture that confounds the scholars that go and visit him, right? That Augustine can see what he wants to be, right? Not the flattered wisdom of himself as a rhetorician in Caesar's court, but wise in sight of the Lord, and the way that that knowing that Anthony had achieved that, had developed those habits of intellect and will, are an encouragement to him in his conversion. And I think Augustine's very mindful of that. And whereas the conversion of St. Anthony is like, we don't see much of that in Athanasius's account of the life of St. Anthony. We see kind of the trials he undergoes, but with Augustine, like, you get into how his psychology, how his temptations, the good of them claw out to him, and yet the higher good wins out. But only once he surrenders, right? His temptations, his lust, his desire for pride, of putting others down, so that he could rise up.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's interesting. I mean, some of the contextual details that I wanted to share regarding just, the call it the Sitz im Leben, or the situation in life that Augustine was experiencing prior to and during the authorship of the work. He writes the work from like 397 to 401 AD. He's already a bishop now, but during that time within Algeria and the surrounding area, there's a fair amount of Christianization that's taking place within the Roman Empire. Augustine has already been influenced by St. Ambrose, so he's been baptized. He's had a theological education, par excellence, through Ambrose in Milan, which had a profound impact on not only his understanding of Scripture and the Trinity, and you can see a lot of that coming through the work itself, just in the way that he reflects and the way that he ties back even his sinful shortcomings to his need for God. He's already struggled against the Manichaeans, and it's interesting because Augustine spent a decent portion of his adolescence going through this intellectual journey in which he's exploring, for lack of a better term, like, what is the meaning of life, and why is he here, and what's the purpose of all of this. And when he's following these teachings of Mani, he's embracing this notion of, kind of a gigantic bodily entity as an explanation of God. And then it's only after he reads the Platonists that he refines his notion of spirit, which then informs his theology and helps him to eventually turn away from Manichaeanism. And then, you have in the Confessions, especially towards the end, you'll see a lot of biblical interpretation, but the particular version of the work that I read it's a nice, along the sides of the book, it has, whenever Augustine is citing or referencing Scripture, there's passages, and it's replete with, from cover to cover, biblical references throughout. You're going to see tons of theological themes, and there's also this aspect of, you brought up Anthony of the Desert, but even within the historical context of Northern Africa, 4th century, Augustine's experiencing, his bishopric in Hippo Regius, but he's also dealing with many of these controversies besides Manichaeism, Donatism, and you're starting to see, even in this work, a reflection that highlights the ways in which you kind of get a glimpse into some of the complexities of the Christian life within that region. And so, there's tons of passages outside of book 2 that would be worth referencing. I limited myself to like 3 or 4. His conversion itself, when he hears the child's voice, Towle, lege, take up and read, and then he picks up the Scripture and kind of, haphazardly kind of turns to a random, what ends up being Romans 13 and 14, where St. Paul basically instructs his followers to put on Christ, rather than rioting, debauchery, strife, or envy, and to make no provision for the flesh. And I think that was an indictment of Augustine's youthful struggle with lust and wantonness. And Jason, when we originally talked about, hey, Mike, what what work would you want to talk about? I think the first thing I said was, hey, has anybody taken On the Incarnation by Athanasius, right? And that was one of the most foundational works that I had read, that not only gave me a really solid understanding of Trinitarian theology and Christology, but it was during grad school that I really kind of went through that book slowly and digested it. So I was really hopeful that I could do that one, but somebody else had already covered that book. And so I was very surprised that nobody had already covered off on the Confessions, because while I think of it as such a foundational text for, I think, most students of theology, it's really, I think, in many ways it's a both and of being a spiritual classic, a heavy hitting autobiography that teaches the reader about embracing redemption through God and not apart from God. But it also kind of puts on display Augustine's intellect and his very practical struggle throughout his life, which I think is very hopeful for Christians in general, right? We get a sense of, even when we've sinned, God is close by. And so, maybe you want to
Yeah.
spend a moment before I dive
Sure.
into the book, but I know you had talked about, the origins of the podcast, Better Pairs. Thought I'd at least give you the opportunity to kind of tee that up.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, no, because you were kind of bringing up sort of his intellectual conversion and sort of the dualism of the Manichaeans, but then sort of the introduction of Platonism or Neoplatonism as he might have experienced it, and sometimes we can kind of look at the Confessions and look at Augustine's life through sort of a Platonic lens, and so you can kind of see sort of a desire for perfection of the form in his teachings later on, and you get these weird kind of situations where there's no true virtue except Christian virtue, and then you have to kind of reconcile that with, well, what does he mean by there's no true virtue except Christian virtue? It's not as if like Ambrose as the governor of Milan is somehow not having any virtue or courage or prudence or whatever, and then he's elected bishop because don't be a upstanding man in society when a bishop dies in the ancient world, because they're going to make you the next one. And it isn't as if the wisdom or the prudence of Ambrose just suddenly came to be once he was baptized and ordained, right? That there was this sort of like a fundamental sort of habituation in what would become Christian virtues, but that they weren't ordered properly to God, right? That they had as their kind of end and their purpose, right? Kind of either sort of a self-serving kind of good ordering of the individual and oneself in society, but not ordered towards something extending beyond human society, right? Kind of, if you think of maybe classical virtues, think Aristotle.
Yeah.
And so Augustine is he is not really living in a world influenced by Aristotle. He's still in a world that is awash in Platonism and Neoplatonism, and yet, right, we do see kind of the habituation of the Christian life, of the virtuous life, that we tend to associate with a more kind of Aristotelian habit formation kind of paradigm, right? One of the things with BetterPears is not so much like, there is sort of the idea of fruit and enjoyment and the goodness that the fathers, right, that because Augustine's father, right, owns BetterPears coming from better trees. So it isn't just sort of like a ressourcement of what is old and what is part of the tradition, but I think in the Confessions as a whole, we see Augustine's concern for the community he keeps, and in kind of in the later books of the autobiographical sections of the Confessions, right, that he basically kind of lives in like a hippie commune, and they're reading books and they're having thoughts, and he recognizes his need to kind of go along this journey of conversion and to have people to talk to along the way, people who have their own struggles, people that he kind of invests into. And the more that he kind of draws out of himself, the more we know about these other people, right, of Alypius and others in his life through his account in the Confessions.
Yeah.
But even to the point where, and this is I'm not sure where in the history of Saint Augustine this comes from. It's not in the Confessions, right? But upon becoming the Bishop of Hippo, right, that he makes it so that the priests of the diocese kind of live with him, right, and have this common life together, and they don't kind of go to their own rectories and live off on their own. But the need for the bishop as episkopos, as shepherd, to be the shepherd of his presbyters, right, and to enjoy that common life together. And I think that's something that the modern world has missed, either in the hierarchy of the church, but missed as a whole of being able to engage the tradition, engage sublime realities, truths that are going to exist when all the ephemeral news of the day is gone, when the weather has changed, right? To be able to talk about kind of eternal things with other people is something that BetterPears seeks to do, either in our online kind of presence, but in our in-person fellowships.
Yeah, well, that's great. Yeah, as you were speaking, I was thinking about Augustine's son out of wedlock, Deodatus, who, you imagine having Augustine as a father and this towering intellect. And, as I was, reading and listening to some things in preparation of this, and I think it was, I can't remember where it was, but somebody highlights the fact that, he was, Deodatus was very engaged in the conversation. And so he was engaged with the philosophers of his day. He was engaged in the conversation. And I think that, you see later on in the Confessions, you see Augustine say, give me chastity and continence, but not yet. And so I think that one thing that Father Matthew Lamb highlighted in during our time at Ave Maria was that Augustine kind of went through a series of different conversions, right? And so his initial conversion would have been an intellectual conversion, and then his later on, which we see sort of in book 7 and 8, when he's basically experienced his conversion. That's more of a religious or spiritual conversion, which ultimately yields the fruit of his labor, which is then ultimately a moral conversion as well. And you can kind of can consolidate the religious and the moral into one or two different conversions depending upon how you look at it. But ultimately, I think that ascent to truth that he experiences is something that is applicable universally, right? The truth is universally shareable. The light of faith enables, it doesn't matter who you are, right? Everyone can enjoy the contemplation of the divine, even if you are not an intellectual heavyweight like Augustine. And so we're seeing, in this work, you're seeing him put on display his own, very erudite intellectual journey, but he's also bringing it down to very tangible, palpable realities. Not very many people have stolen pears and thrown them away just to do it, but people can appreciate and identify with simple human goof ups and times when we've decided to do something that made us fall short of God's plan for us. And so I think that there's a lot of rich wisdom to be learned when we look at things in such a concrete manner. One other quick vignette before we go to book 2 in proper, even though we've kind of been dancing around it, is just towards the end of book 9, I think, chapter 11, Augustine and his brother are with his mom, Monica, and she's basically, this is kind of before she dies, and she's basically telling them, bury my body anywhere, do not worry about it at all. All I ask is that you remember me at the altar of the Lord, wherever you may be. And I think that that is such a testimony to both of these saints and their, I'd call it like an eternal purview. Um,
Hmm.
Monica, she's been praying for the vast majority of Augustine's youth for him to have this conversion. And she goes on to say, now she can die in peace because he's had this conversion. But she has such a lowly sense of herself in the grand scheme of things. But she's still asking for them to remember her at the altar, which I think is something that we all ought to strive for, right? Like not only prayers for the dead, but also hoping that we're living a life that is worthy of being remembered at the altar. Um, so those were some of the cursory thoughts that I had on the work as a whole. As I as I
Sure.
went as I
As we
went through book two.
dance around the orchard, let's get to the pears.
Yeah. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I definitely want to focus on, right? So there's this struggle with some people call it like a sexual sin or a carnal custom, the consuetudo carnalis in the Latin. Um, it depends upon who you're talking to. One of our classmates at Ave Maria just published a work. Tom Harmon, Dr. Tom Harmon, he just wrote The Universal Way of Salvation and the Thought of St. Augustine. And he has a quote that I thought is worth just mentioning here. He said that, in the Confessions, Augustine tells how his slavery to the consueto carnalis, while inherited, is also freely chosen. The content of the consuetudo carnalis is Augustine's habitual preference of temporal goods over eternal goods, which violates the eternal law, according to which it is just that everything be ordered in the highest degree. Now, Tom goes on to talk a little bit about this distinguishing between the temporal and the eternal goods, and how Augustine's tutelage under the Platonist philosophers was able to give him a notion of the incorporeal substance, which I think I highlighted a little bit earlier. But he then goes on to say that this watershed moment in Augustine's life shows him what has been the goal of all his striving. God, now understood as incorporeal substance and creator. And I think it's really important for us as we're looking at book two in particular to remember that, he may not have had this perception of God in those years, but those
Mm.
strivings that he was yearning for, I think that's a universal experience that people have. Like pretty much everybody goes through some sort of conversion in their life. Hopefully they do, and as you do, there's inevitably going to be some form of rebellion. Whether it's outward or inward, and as you're going through that, you might not have a proper understanding. You might have not been properly catechized, or maybe you did and you just like to sin, like most of us. And so you have that experience, and then it's only afterwards that you have that ability to reflect back and say, okay, well, golly, like I. I was striving for something. I was aiming for some sort of temporal good, some sort of momentary fleeting happiness. But I think it's once Augustine has matured in his own spirituality, and he has that intellectual conversion, he's then able to put pen to paper in a way that tells us a little bit more of what was actually taking place as he was yearning for those things and not finding that rest that his soul longed for. So that's one thing.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, part of it is. Do you think some of that has to do with like one's frame of temporal reference, right? Because before book two, there's book one, and at that point, Augustine's not kind of like imagining what he thought of as a kid, but he makes this reference to having watched infants afterwards, and realized that, man, these people are like terrors, right? It's only because their limbs are not very strong that they don't cause harm to their nurses, because they just want what they want now.
yeah.
And they have, and some of it is that they don't have a frame of reference of kind of right immediate kind of denial, so that I can have a higher good later, right? It's the marshmallow problems.
Yeah.
And I think some of that is played out in book two, insofar as he doesn't have appropriate teachers, right? His Patricius, his father, not gonna, he's a sort of
He just wants Augustine to be successful. in a
He's a
world
catechumen for a really
in a
long
world,
time.
yeah,
Yeah.
in a worldly way.
Exactly. Right. So these sort of, but even that the success in a worldly way through rhetoric or his education, right, is still like a detachment from immediate enjoyment, because you have to like study and do hard things in school in order to get the payoff. But that
Yeah,
horizon of the work to the payoff, right, the labor to the fruit, is still within a human scale and not within a divine scale yet.
yeah,
Right. So I think there's some of it of the way that Augustine sort of relating his own life and coming to terms with it is sort of like the divine pedagogy of how the whole human family is just sort of like fumbling around trying to deal with this thing called original sin, and none of it's working,
yeah.
right? And until God tells us kind of how that solution is to come about and that we can cooperate with it, it is sort of a tragedy of the Old Testament of kings coming and screwing up, or kings coming and not screwing up as much, but still kind of screwing up, right? That I think he's trying to give it a perspective, like the perspective of the whole human family, and yet at the same time it's his particular life. There's sort of a one for all kind of way that I think book 2 in particular can kind of oscillate back and forth for us as the reader.
Yeah, there's a series by then Father Robert Barron called Seven Deadly Sins, Seven Lively Virtues, and as he's walking through Dante's, I think it's the Purgatorio. I can't. It's the Divine Comedy. I don't remember which book, but as he walking through it, at one point he says, and I can't remember who he's referring to when he uses this analogy, but he says we're all on the same boat and we're all seasick. And I think, that's the human condition, right? But there's also, I mean, I think of St. Paul, Romans chapter 7, verse 19. I do not understand my own actions, for I do not do what I want, but I do the very thing that I hate. And I think that there's a certain aspect of Augustine's experience as a youth and as an adolescent in which, ultimately he knows right and wrong, but he's not living it out. And so I think during most of those formative years, he didn't have enough of the proper catechesis to truly live out a virtuous life, but he had enough to know that some of the things that he was doing was wrong, which he highlights when he's reflecting on the Pears. And so I think there's this whether you want to call it the carnal habit, or whatever you want to describe, concupiscence, whatever it may be, that it's that struggling with our flesh that is universal to everyone. And so Augustine in book 2 says, he comes to the conclusion that he ultimately sought only to, he was seeking to love and be loved, but he was caught up in the vapors of murky lust of the flesh, of the bubbling sores of puberty, which so clouded and darkened my heart that I could not distinguish the clear brightness of love from the fog of lust. And so, I think that, as we look at the human condition and we look at the way in which we all fall short of the glory of God, the reality is that Augustine is highlighting it in a very apropos way in this particular book within the work as well.
Yeah, no, there's a part of maybe the last couple minutes here of our discussion where we do sound like defense attorneys for like juvenile, defendants, which is I think appropriate, and yet at the same time, let's get into the substance of the case here. What do you see going on in the orchard? What plays out for you? Augustine gives his own kind of take on it, but is there anything that you gleaned from this event that, like, once it happens in book 2, it pretty much like dominates the rest of the book?
Yeah, well, so I think there's a lot that's going on there, and I think that as we think about his own, I don't know if you want to call it like a psychological and a moral journey. I think we're seeing. I mean, it's such a it's almost a jarring. Anybody that picks up the book is going to remember the Pears. Anybody that picks up the book is going to recognize that it's almost like it's almost laughable how insignificant the trifle is, but how he's made it paramount in his own life, and I think that
Mm,
that's why it stands out. Um, and let's not forget that he's also wrestling with debauchery and licentiousness. So he's got a lot going on. But I think that for him to pause and spend a decent amount of time speaking about how he was um, giving in to these wanton passions, but then he also pauses and spends such a length of time on these pairs. I think that for him, it's a realization that he was longing for something, but that it was all falling short of God. I know that in kind of in the thick of things, as he's describing it, he said that he was, let's see here. He said that he's speaking to God, and he says, "You were always present, raging against me in your mercy, and scattering the most bitter vexations over all my illicit joys, so that I would look for a joy that had no vexation and find that I could have none outside of you, O Lord, outside of you who make suffering into a teacher and strike in order to heal and kill us lest we die apart from you." I think that, I mean, first of all, extremely poetic language, but it's also that realization that, I mean, you can look at the pairs on a number of different scales, right? I mean, he just basically talks about the better, like, hey, these were beautiful pairs, but they weren't that great, and I definitely didn't take them because there was anything special about them, and I ultimately just threw them away because I had better pairs. So there's the just the practical aspect of, I took the pairs and they really didn't mean all that much, and I just did it to do it. Then there's the aspect of um, the peer pressure, which I don't think that he's trying to embrace some sort of um, Adamic scapegoating where he's
mm,
basically trying to say, like, she did it. Um, I think he's actually saying it's less about. He does say that he wouldn't have done it if the friends weren't there, if the comrades weren't with him, he would have not done it, which I think is telling. But at the same time, I don't think that it's they made me do it. I think it's more of a, I got caught up in going along with the thing with the friends instead of, I know right from wrong and I should have chosen otherwise. I think there's also a certain aspect of, I mean, when we talk about Pauline theology and we talk about the fruits of the spirit, or we talk about um, you know just you shall know them by their fruits. I think that I don't want to get too far afield on the kind of a spiritual reading of it, but I do think that there is a certain aspect of, when he talks about these better pairs, I know that he's first and foremost literally talking, like you'd mentioned earlier, about his father's vineyard or whatever. He's got access to
hmm
more desirable pairs, but I think that there's also an aspect of him sort of also hinting at this idea of, God's got the good stuff, and that was just a temporary, juvenile, you know, missing of the mark, a sinful, passionate giving into, something because he was going along with friends. Whereas I think that there's a certain deeper truth, which is that, God can, in fact, actually use suffering as a teacher, strike in order to heal. Because ultimately, in the zero sum game of, eternity, what we're doing here on earth matters. And if we're dying apart from God, that's an eternal decision. And so I think that there's something to be said for, although we ought not to read passages of scripture like, pluck out your eyes as, hey, the first time that you look upon somebody lustfully, boom, everybody's going to become blind. The whole human race would be disfigured in many different ways, from overeating and lustful looking and, prideful thinking. I mean, we wouldn't be able to function as humans if we took that literally. But at the same time, in the zero sum game of, are you going to heaven or hell, it is better that you would lose your eyes than suffer hellfire for eternity. And so I think that Augustine is in some ways using potent imagery to paint a picture of how, dysfunctional and disconnected his misspent youth was, because he's engaging in wild and erotic adventures as a teenager, driven by an insatiable desire for pleasure. But he acknowledges that one true desire was to love and be loved, but it was unfortunately distorted by these misdirected passions. So that's kind of where I go with it. But I guess what else do you think? What came to mind for
Yeah.
you?
No, it's interesting that you kind of made that reference to Adam. I had this sort of like side joke to Father Lamb back at Ave Maria about just this was a joke, but like, did he really still steal pears? Because maybe he stole apples because it seems more kind of conducive. But then they have the problem where he talks about how like the sin was in the theft and not in in Latin the word for apple is mala, and it would just be confusing as to whether the evil was the apple or the evil was in the theft. So linguistically, it doesn't really play out. And then Father Lamb shot back with this like, "Whoa, well, I know this couple and they're horticultural anthropologists or whatever, and it seems really doubtful that pears would have been domesticated by that point in history in northern Africa." And I'm like, that I did not expect you to have friends in this field that justify that argument. So there is this sort of like kind of intentionality, I think, of it being pears and kind of like the weightiness of them. Sometimes I wonder, like as you were talking, like this poor neighbor who lost his pears, and yet also this neighbor who is making inferior pears. So as part of like the BetterPears enterprise, like I have actually planted some pears in my yard. In just sort of like, well, what's it like to grow pears? Like that's kind of what we do here. I have a pear-based business, even though we don't actually necessarily sell pears. It is a pear-themed enterprise, and I'm waiting for the fruit. Like they were like yearling trees or whatever, and it's been, I think maybe next year we'll see some actual fruit. And so this idea of this effort that's going into this neighbor's pear growing, maybe they're on the back 40 and he doesn't pay attention to them, and that's why they're not doing all that well. But the idea that young people enjoy fruit that is of lesser quality, and yet that might actually be somebody's job to produce fruit or entertainments, right? Things to be enjoyed that are not really satisfying their intended audience. And so on the one hand, BetterPears is designed to provide better fruit for the human soul, to work on giving people things to think about in terms of our online presence, right? Things to think about and engage with others in our in-person fellowships, because that's where the things of real meaning, that's where lives get changed, when you have kind of that spark of wonder that then disabuses you of seeing things in the way that they are not, right? If you start to see things the way that they are, then you can't ignore that truth.
Yeah.
And yet how many people are caught up in a world of providing sort of lesser fruit, and would that they, how do they feel? How does that neighbor feel knowing that not only did his neighbor kids abuse his trees and destroy his crops, but that they actually didn't really find them as the best things to steal?
Yeah, absolutely. And I wouldn't be a good student of Father Lamb and Dr. Levering if I didn't at least try to bring Aquinas in before we wrap up. So I know that in the Summa, I believe it's the Prima Pars, question 12, article 1, Aquinas is asking whether the intellect can see the essence of God, and he actually brings in book 2 of the Confessions, and he basically acknowledges that, essentially, as Augustine is describing his intellectual struggles to understand God's nature, that Aquinas is drawing parallels between Augustine's experience and his own philosophical and theological reflections. And he basically says, okay, so, Augustine's statement, I didn't know what God was or what he was not, and affirms, it's a limitation of human reason. So I think when the rubber meets the road, we've got to be able to say that, unaided by faith, or divine revelation, the human intellect cannot grasp the essence of God, but that facilitated by divine illumination and faith, then we can take those necessary steps towards God, as he pulls us towards him. I always think of Lamb's, emphasis upon the exitus reditus, and how our participation in that is ultimately coming from God and going back to God. And so when I think of the importance of faith and divine revelation in supplementing human reason, it allows us to have this deeper understanding of God's nature, which then in turn, as you look at the confessions and you look at the way in which Augustine is going through, these formative years in which he doesn't understand God. He's striving for something. He wants something, but ultimately, even though it's to love and be loved, he doesn't have the right framework to. The limitations of human reason are very front and center clear. And so I think, in a nutshell, I think what it highlights is that not only is a conversion required, but there's ultimately a requirement of a need for a synthesis of reason and faith, in which, you can have an intellectual journey, but ultimately not have that, some people call it like the head journey to the heart journey, where, you can understand the knowing enables the loving, but both are required in order for us to assent to God and his will for our lives. And I think that Augustine's Pear story is a great example of how in his wantonness he just turned away, but then in his reflection thereafter he recognizes that it actually provided him with an example to experience conversion, and ultimately, brought him closer to God in his reflection. So,
Yeah, no, there was a lot there, and thank you for sharing it, because I think one of the things I took away was that sort of that the supplementation of the light of faith to the light of reason, right? And that this sort of participatory theology, or this theology of participation, in which like the good life is a participation insofar it is good in eternal life, right? That the what is natural, right? It doesn't have to just simply stop being natural in order to be something divine, something filled with the life of grace, but
yeah,
that nature is perfected through grace.
the higher
And
doesn't
and
negate
even
the lower.
exactly, and even though that becomes more sort of like kind of established and written in stone in various books in the Middle Ages, right? Even in Augustine's time, right? The fathers understood how God was active in the world, and that the trials they would go through, the temptations that they would go through, were part of a greater whole of them entering into union with him, right? The theosis of the Greeks, right? This sort of participation in the divine life, the grace as understood in the West. So,
Yeah,
that I think that's a great way to kind of
a great way to end for the Doctor of Grace.
Yeah, frame the Doctor of Grace, frame Book 2. So thank you again, Michael, for sharing your insights in Book 2 of the Confessions with us today, and for being our guest on the show.
Thanks for
to
having
our
me,
audience. Yeah, no, pleasure to have you. To our audience, from all of us here at the Confederal Reserve and the BetterPears Cultural Empire, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time on the Confederal Reserve. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can click here to watch a recent interview of the Confederal Reserve, or over here to view the playlist of the BetterPears podcast.